In tonight's stream, we're just going to do a quick overview of Unit 5 revolutions. So it's about to come at you, because Unit 5 consists of 10 topics, really. The first topic primarily is dealing with the Enlightenment. And so we're going to start out tonight with some Enlightenment documents. We're going to think about those ways of thought, or the thinking that leads to these revolutions. Now, the Enlightenment doesn't just influence political revolutions of the American Revolution, et cetera, but it also influences social change as well, especially when we start thinking about women's rights and the push for more rights for women, the voting, pushing for women's suffrage as we get into the second half of the 19th century, as we see women's roles change quite a bit in this time period, not just taking more responsibility in kind of this industrial world and assisting and being a part of revolutions, but also seeing them become more active and demanding a voice. And by the early 1900s, gaining the right to vote, especially in this country. So the Enlightenment, of course, is kind of the classical sense of it. We'll talk about Locke and Montesquieu. That's covered in this unit as well. The second thing that's really covered in this revolutions in Unit 5 are nationalism, the rise of nationalism, and the political revolutions from 1750 to 1900. Those are the Atlantic revolutions especially, but also getting into some nationalist movements across Europe. And so that's covered in this unit. And lastly, the Industrial Revolution, which comprises most of the topics in this unit. I'm just going to read them off to you. Topic 5.3, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Then the spread of the Industrial Revolution. So kind of looking at the first and second phases, or what we often call the first Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution. Technology of the Industrial Age is one topic, thinking about what the specific technology is. We'll talk about what images or documents you might get, sources you might get, you might see on a test for that. Industrialization, the government's role. We'll touch on that tonight. Economic developments and innovations in the industrial age, reactions to the industrial economy, and society in the industrial age. So, and then change and continuity. So, which is the whole, which will be our stream next week. So it runs the gamut here. It really does. It's a big unit in the book. It's an important foundational unit to understand what comes after. Unit 6 will deal with consequences of industrialization. So that's one thing to consider. Unit 7, global conflict that results from competition that comes out of that industrialization in Unit 6. So lots of stuff covered here. And our goal of this, as I said, is not necessarily to rehash all of it, but instead to maybe see what it'll actually look like when you come face to face with it on the exam. And then we'll look at some primary sources today and try to figure out what we can figure from this era. So let's start with topic 5.1 here. And I'm just going to kind of give a brief overview of our topics as we go through them tonight, and talk about documents you might see on the exam or sources you might see on the AP exam, and then we'll look at some examples, one or two examples from each of the topics we're going to cover tonight. Although we will group together industrialism into all of those smaller topics into one tonight. So the first thing we see here is, when we're thinking about the Enlightenment, what are documents that we might get? Well, the first thing you'll know are Enlightenment philosophers, our major philosophers of this era. Those are John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire, Mary Wollstonecraft, who kind of pops up. You can see her name further down on this list too, so we'll talk about that for a moment. But these Enlightenment thinkers who really are going to challenge the status quo, challenge absolute power, and rethink where the power of government comes from, right? The Enlightenment seeks to really try to solve society's ills by thinking critically about how we govern or how society is formed. And instead of this idea of divine right, top down, they begin to think differently. John Locke believed that the power of government came from the consent of the governed, right? The people themselves give government power. He believed that everybody had natural rights, and the government's job was to protect those natural rights. But when those rights were infringed upon, those rights of life, liberty, and property, when they were infringed upon, then something was awry, and people had the right or the duty to do something about it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau would expand on this with the idea of social contract, right? There's this contract between the government and the people among themselves, that they agree to give up certain rights, and thus, if everybody gives up the rights, then everyone is more free. The Baron de Montesquieu challenged absolutist rule and corruption of power. He believed in the separation of powers, different branches of government, executive, judicial, legislative. Some of these ideas already might be kind of sparking something in the back of your head, I hope. So if you recognize some of these, just put up some exclamation points or your best emoji if you're feeling good about this in the chat. But these are ideas that become foundational for the United States and for revolutions in general. And seeing, oh, nice, good, big smiley face. That's what I like to see. Things that you're recognizing here. Voltaire was very critical of religion. In some ways, he represents kind of that push for separation of church and state. Also the belief in freedom of speech and the like. Mary Wollstonecraft pushing for women's rights and really arguing for the position of women as intellectual equals in the Enlightenment. So these thinkers are extremely important. You're likely to see a lot of their or some of their writings in your AP course, whether it's on your teacher's exams or on the final AP exam, or perhaps just the topic of the Enlightenment itself coming up. So knowing those is certainly worthwhile, but I would never be surprised if I saw the writings of any of these people on the exam, though I'm going to kind of go off the wall for the example I give you. The second thing that often pops up in this, and that's because these writings are specifically named is what we call illustrative examples of thinking in this time, especially in dealing with women's rights and the Enlightenment. And those are demands for women's rights in the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft, especially her treatise A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which you may have read in your classes. One that we're actually going to look at in a minute, Olympe de Gouges, an important feminist figure from the French Revolution, eventually loses her head, accused of being a monarchist and sympathetic to the monarchy in France. Kind of put on trial in a show trial, eventually lose her head. But she pens a quite revolutionary document, the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, not to be confused with the Declaration of the Rights of men and citizen. And then lastly, in 1848 in the United States, an important document comes out of the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments, which I don't know why I didn't put the name there. I don't think the name is listed in the key concepts, but Declaration of Sentiments comes out of that convention in the United States, demanding greater equality for women and really becoming the birth of what will become modern feminist movements in the U.S. So these are some documents you may see come out of the Enlightenment. Seneca Falls Conference documents are quite late in that, but the others are much earlier. Mary Wollstonecraft, a contemporary of Rousseau. In fact, they write back and forth, and they insult each other, which is quite fun to read. But let's look at an example of these documents. And I really just want to start with just looking at a document today, not necessarily with this document, trying to break it down to answer any specific questions, but to give you an idea of the revolutionary nature of this type of thinking. And this is from Olympe de Gouges, again, writing in the late 1700s, right, in the 1790s. And this is her introduction to the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. All right. So man, are you capable of being just? Is it a woman who poses the question? It is a woman who poses the question. You will not deprive her of that right at least. Tell me, what gives you sovereign empire to oppress my sex? Your strength? Your talents? Observe the Creator in his wisdom. Survey in all her grandeur that nature with whom you seem to want to be in harmony. And give me, if you dare, an example of this tyrannical empire. Go back to animals, consult the elements, study plants, finally glance at all the modifications of organic matter and surrender to the evidence when I offer you the means. Search, probe, and distinguish, if you can, the sexes in the administration of nature. Everywhere you will find them mingled. Everywhere the cooperation in harmonious togetherness in this immortal masterpiece. This is just the introduction to this Declaration of the Rights of Women, people, by the way. Absolutely fantastic, in my humble opinion. Man alone has raised his exceptional circumstances to a principle, bizarre, blind, bloated with science, and degenerated in a century of enlightenment and wisdom into the crassest ignorance. So here she's making reference to all of these things that of the time period, important intellectuals, typically male, are referred to as examples of how they are the most civilized in history, right? A lot of connections to nature, mentioning of science, scientific revolution. But there's what she's saying is they have bent this to their will, right? With crass ignorance. He wants to command as a despot a sex which is in full possession of its intellectual faculties. He pretends to enjoy the revolution, meaning the French Revolution here, and to claim his rights to equality in order to say nothing more about it. So in this, she's pointing out the hypocrisy, right, of these men who are still seeking to, as she puts it, rule over women, right? Command as a despot a sex which is in full possession of their intellectual faculties. So a group that is just naturally as bright, just naturally as smart, and capable as men. And this was quite revolutionary, as during the French Revolution, women were seeking greater equality. They hoped that the revolution wouldn't just abolish, say, the classes of France, but also perhaps maybe some of the gender discrimination that was apparent too. And this document, of course, connects to a lot of the others. A lot of the other trends in this time period. It mentions the Enlightenment. It mentions the importance of science, kind of appealing to that reason, right? Another name for the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. So trying to reason that. And then, of course, from here, which is not included, there are, she basically rewrites the Declaration of the Rights of Man to include women and demands for equality. This is the type of revolutionary documents that were coming out of this era, right? Not just the Declaration of Independence, which we'll look at, and not just the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which of course we can look at, but the pushes for new social change in this era. So pretty dynamic. If you see this document or any part of this, hopefully you'll have a little bit more background on it, but a direct challenge to the male-dominated society as it existed in the late 1800s, or excuse me, the early 1800s in this case, because we're talking about around 1790, I guess late 1700s, early 1800s. Got to get my dates right, guys. It's early in the semester. Certainly this emergent feminism typically does show up in the exam. Again, it may not be Olympe de Gouges when you see it, but oftentimes the Seneca Falls Convention or Mary Wollstonecraft they make reference to. So let's think beyond the Enlightenment, right? Just kind of getting started with some basic documents. You may be familiar more so with documents of nationalism and revolutions, right? The Atlantic revolutions. And when we think about the AP exam, there are really, if we think about any documents, really, there's three big ones of this era. Here I've called them the big three. That's not an official name, mind you. It's just one that Mr. Lassiter throws around when he feels like it. But the big three we tend to think of are the American Declaration of Independence, penned by Thomas Jefferson, France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which comes out of the French Revolution. And that's the image you see here, kind of a elaborate painting of that important document, important world document, modeled off of the Declaration of Independence to an extent. And then lastly, one that you may not be quite as familiar with, Simon Bolivar's Letter from Jamaica. Now, all three of these documents in our video I did on the revolutions back in November or December, it's been a while, I can't remember which, I think it was November. We went and looked at pieces of all these. What we're going to look at from Simon Bolivar's letter, though, today is a little bit of a different excerpt, which I pulled. Of course, nationalist or revolutionary images typically come up in this time period. So we'll have an example of that momentarily. Images that are representative of the feeling of the times in this revolutionary era. A lot of political cartoons come up. If they're American political cartoons, typically poking fun at King George III. Some cartoons, British cartoons, which are very critical of American colonists and kind of running rampant and rebelling. One which we'll see in a little bit from the French Revolution. But you also might have private journals, letters from people like John Adams and to his wife Abigail, speeches that highlight nationalist tendencies or nationalist feelings in countries, especially those, because remember, this is a large time period, 1750 to 1900, some of which are kind of at the will of European imperialism, and some which are seeking revolution. And some just unification. German nationalism comes about in this time period. Italian nationalism comes about in this time period. So you're going to see typically a lot of those types of sources. So let's look at some of them. Here we have a quote from the Declaration of Independence. This is from the beginning of the Declaration, before you get to the long list of grievances against the king. And you are very likely familiar with this or have heard this before. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it and to institute new government. So it goes on a little bit beyond that. So I'll let you keep reading. You see here a facsimile of that declaration. But what I want to do is think about this question, right? We're getting closer to some multiple choice, short answer type stuff that you would get. But just think about this question as you read this. In what ways did the Declaration of Independence exemplify the ideals of the Enlightenment? We could tell you all day that it is born out of the Enlightenment, but can you pick out phrases or quotes that really make that connection? If you see any right now, I'll give you a moment to do so. Any phrase, set of words that you associate with the Enlightenment, put it in the chat right here. I'll give you a shout out. Go ahead and read through the rest of it. What are some of these words that you would associate with Enlightenment ideals? All right, already getting a few people. Excellent. My lag time is not too long. BJ's chiming in here. Excellent. Life, liberty, property. Yeah, here Jefferson doesn't use that term though, does he? When you got to change a couple of the words when you're paraphrasing someone like John Locke in his well-known words. So he uses that word pursuit of happiness, but I like how BJ puts property there in caps. We all know what he means. Sonny, all men are created equal. Yes, very much so. This idea also coming from John Locke that people are born equal, right? It is not, they're not born into hierarchy. That is something that everybody's kind of born with what he believes is this like tabula rasa. They're a blank slate, right? Everyone is equal, or should be equal under the law. And that's an important principle where, in Europe, the tradition was not so much that, right? We had a nobility that was born into this hierarchy. So literal hierarchy based on your hereditary status. Certain unalienable rights. Yeah, Jaina, that you are definitely right. Those unalienable rights he names, right? The ones that BJ mentioned. So if we're thinking in this way and we're trying to make these connections, then these documents really become alive. And you start to see that, Thomas Jefferson wasn't just like spouting a bunch of I don't want to use, how do I say this nicely? He wasn't just saying a bunch of things to confuse the other side and try to look pretty and make himself sound really smart. These ideas, which he puts forth in the Declaration of Independence, come out of an intellectual movement that he really forms his opinions of the world around. Excellent. Sonny coming in again. Government's power is from the governed, right? Yeah, that idea that the government's power doesn't necessarily just come from some far off God and they ordain you. No, it comes from the people, right? That consent of the governed. Excellent job. Excellent job. So here I've just highlighted some of the phrases that stood out to me. Some of the ones that you mentioned: inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that idea of consent of the governed. All these mentioned by you. This is great. And in this idea that, we see with Locke and Rousseau, what happens if the government doesn't protect those rights? Well, the people have the right to alter that government or abolish it, or at least should have that right. And if that's prevented, well, what you have in the United States was revolution. And so he talks about despotism, which I think is an interesting connection to what what Olympe de Gouges was talking about in the French Revolution about men in France. Despots themselves, men trying to rule over women. That term really kind of thrown around by these Enlightenment thinkers as an intentional insult, right? So it is their right, it is their duty to throw off the government. And we could go deeper into the Declaration and the causes and some of the things the colonists accused the king of. And they very much are along the same lines of other Enlightenment thinkers, abolishing trying to prevent the colonial governments from meeting, or limiting the right of a free and open press, limiting the right for trade. So all of these things kind of are seen and come together. So think about these documents this way. Of course, look at the documents, look at the I didn't maybe do as good of a job with all of these images, for example, the Declaration of Independence with your sourcing information. But look at that information, try to think about what's going on in that time period and how you can connect it. Very often when you're seeing these documents, it's going to ask you to connect it to causes and effects of these revolutions or to Enlightenment ideals. Let's look at another image. This one is one that you may have seen before. We have a cartoon here from 1789. It's a color engraving of the French Revolution. And I have a question here. So now we're going to kind of dive into some of these and see what kind of questions we can come up with. So if you know the answer, or when you know the answer, put it in the chat. Yeah, see how it goes. We'll read through it. So here we have an image. We see several people in this image, 3 people, what looks like some animals down the bottom, but primarily the center of the image, what we need to be paying attention to are these 3 fellows. Oh yeah, we have some rabbits at the bottom. Rabbits at the bottom. Is that what we got? Yeah. So in this image, the views expressed in this image most directly contributed to which of the following? All right. Which of the following? So the establishment of a 4th estate in the country of France. B, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. C, the leveling of taxes across France by King Louis XVI. Or D, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. A couple of people chiming in already. We have a couple different answers. Give you a moment's more. All right, let's see what we have. A few people. Oh, Sunny's changing her answer. Again, no, there's nothing to be worried about here. Throw an answer up if you got it. See if anybody else wants to give it a shot. No need to worry about being incorrect. So you can do it in your head. That sounds fine. So what we have here is an image. Let's talk about what's in this image. And if you know what this is in reference to something that is going on in France, or something that has been a part of French society for hundreds of years. I want to know who is represented in this image. So if you have an idea, throw it up in the chat. What are these three men depicted here? What are they representing? All right, so what we see in this image are two people who are dressed quite well here on the back of a man who maybe not dressed as well, right? He's bent over, looks haggard, looks like he's being kind of torn apart a little bit, really in bad shape, but at the same time carrying these other two gentlemen. And what this image is representing are the three estates of France, right? The idea that we have traditionally in France these three categories of people. The first estate, which is the clergy, which you see here depicted on the top right. The second estate, the nobility, depicted here in these fancy pants and with sword, and of course typical high heels for these fancy men. And the nobility, the members of the second estate. And then the person who's back there is in reference to the third estate, which was everybody else in France who were not members of the clergy or not members of the nobility. So we're talking about most of the country. 95% would be my guess, what we're talking about here with the country. However, it was the third estate that contributed almost all of the tax monies in France. The nobility and the clergy were exempt from taxation. And so when we think about how France literally funded itself, funded its government, funded its defense, that was off the backs, literally, of the lower classes. And so here it's quite critical of these upper classes who kind of have it easy on the backs of the third estate. Now, this being critical of this image being quite critical of this system leading up to the French Revolution is going to precipitate some change. And in this case, what we're looking for is that change would be to that social class system. Now, taxes are one of the reasons why the Estates General is called. King Louis the 16th needs to raise taxes. However, before that can be accomplished, the third estate marches out, declares themselves the National Assembly, and then very soon after issues the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which effectively abolishes this estates system, these three estates, thus making people much more equal. And so this and giving the third estate much more opportunity within France, particularly the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class of France, who was kind of leading this charge. So the French Revolution, of course, was not just a political, but also a social revolution. So that's what we have to remember. In fact, the social changes and the spirit of the revolution, the nationalism that is that comes out of this are really kind of the long-lasting effects of that revolution. As after Napoleon is defeated, a king is put back on the throne of France, unfortunately. Of course, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was that second of those major documents that I brought up earlier. So let's take a look at an excerpt of this. And again, you're going to see some of those same Enlightenment ideals that we identified in the Declaration of Independence show up here in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. For one, it is modeled off of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which was written about 13 years earlier. But men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Right? We saw that idea, all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. We see that here in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Well, think about what that image back here was critical of. Those social distinctions based on birth, and the fact that just because one might be born to the nobility or be born to a class in which you could afford to be educated and become members of the clergy, where your station may depend on your status as members of the nobility or not, they're saying that those distinctions can't be found in that way anymore. These hereditary social classes, do away with them. It is not the way society should be organized. Let's go on further, right? In the Declaration of Rights of Man, it talks about natural rights, life, property, security, and resistance to oppression is how they're enumerated in this document. Law is the expression of the general will, right? This idea of the will of the people. And then later on, we have this idea that was not highlighted in the Declaration of Independence, but is highlighted here. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. That idea of free and open communication and freedom of speech. Every citizen may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom. Right. So that's an idea that comes from, well, many different thinkers, but Voltaire, one of the chief among them. All right. Let's look further. And here we have excerpts from Simón Bolívar's Jamaica letter. Now, this letter is quite long. It's a letter from Jamaica letter, whatever you want to call it. So this is just a small excerpt of a very long document that is much longer than the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. So when you see this document, you may not instantaneously recognize something that comes from it. It may be something that a different part of the letter related to something that you might not realize right away what it is. So let's take a look here, though. Americans today, and perhaps to a greater extent than ever before, who live within the Spanish system, occupy a position in society no better than the serfs destined for labor, or at best, they have no more status than that of mere consumers. Yet even this status is surrounded with galling restrictions, such as being forbidden to grow European crops, or to store products which are royal monopolies, or to establish factories of a type the peninsula itself does not possess, and that peninsula in reference to the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain is located. To this add the exclusive trading privileges, even in articles of prime necessity, and the barriers between American provinces designed to prevent all exchange of trade, traffic, and understanding. In short, do you wish to know what our future held? Simply the cultivation of fields of indigo, grain, coffee, sugarcane, cacao, and cotton. Cattle raising on the broad plains, hunting wild game, digging in the earth to mine its gold. But even these limitations could never satisfy the greed of Spain. Man, really kind of digging in there, really evocative imagery of limitations being placed on the Americas and Americans, of which Bolivar was one, and by that I mean of the Americas, in this case Latin America. He's writing from Jamaica in the Caribbean, but he's from South America, Colombia, and Venezuela, and what is it? Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, I think is what he unites in Gran Colombia. So what kind of questions could be asked from this? Well, we know that there's kind of this era of revolution here, but what question might we get? Well, here's one. And let's see what we can think about with this. According to the source, which of the following does Bolivar highlight as a reason for revolution in America? All right. So take a look here. And I see a question from BJ here. Creole is the question. Yes, Bolivar himself, yeah, you're right, 100%, is a Creole, which means European, kind of pure European ancestry, but born in the Americas, as opposed to the Peninsulares, who were the highest caste at this time, born back in the Iberian Peninsula. So according to the source, which of the following does Bolivar highlight as a reason for revolution? Put your answer in the chat. Don't be afraid. Want to get everybody in on this. Is it the mercantilist policies of European governments? Unequal distribution of wealth among social classes? Racism against mestizos and mulattoes in the castas system? Or the destruction of agriculture in the Americas? Sunny's in first, followed by BJ. Doing a great job in the chat today. You get Logan and Jana back in, and anybody else. Thanks for the compliment on the question. You may use it as needed. That's right. Our first couple people in are correct. Mercantilist policies here of European governments. That's what's being highlighted in this document. So, and as Eric's chiming in, AP World definitely loves this document. And one of the reasons I think, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that there are just so many different parts, so many different things covered in this document. It is one that is, touched on Enlightenment ideals, touched on economics, touches on relationships between the Americas and Europe. Here, he's talking primarily about those mercantilist policies, right? Exclusive trading privileges, European royal monopolies, which are restricting what Americans can trade for, basically saying that they're being forced to only be those producers of cash crops, right? Their economies are somewhat stymied by this greed, as he calls it, of Spain. We can only grow sugarcane, coffee, cotton. We can't do anything else. We can't trade with whom we want. We can't even produce things that might be in, we can't even build factories here. The Industrial Revolution is the beginning. Why can't we build factories? Because we're at the whim of Spain, right? And their mercantilism. So here's a follow-up question to that. Which of the following, and this is kind of builds on the previous question, but doesn't necessarily pull straight from the document. Which of the following individuals most influenced changes in the economic systems described by Bolivar? So here, this question is asking certainly about, which of these individuals is going to cause change in this mercantilist system, and presumably we would think more immediate. Well, with Jefferson, we don't think too much about. While he does kind of rail against the British. This is occurring after Jefferson has done his major writings and after Jefferson has been president. So he has not changed this system too much. Marx comes along in the 1840s, certainly is going to have an impact on industrialization. But the system being described here is mercantilism. And that system of trade where European countries use trade monopolies. And the person who really turns that on their head is a guy who you actually might see a lot of sources from, and that is Adam Smith, who writes a famous book that the AP, I think, also likes to pull some stuff out of, or at least practice books love it, and that is Out of the Wealth of Nations. And so Adam Smith in that talks about capitalism and free trade, free and open trade, more so laissez-faire economics, where the government is more hands-off rather than really hands-on with mercantilism. And he believes that will encourage competition and grow economies. And with the problems that come with capitalism, that happens. But Adam Smith, in a way, is right. Economies boom after mercantilism kind of goes away, partially because of revolutions and partially because of policy changes. Marx himself is certainly going to be critical of the capitalism that Adam Smith ushers in. But the correct answer here, the answer I was going for, although we might say this question might not have been as good, Adam Smith here, right? So he is influencing changes in that mercantilism, that movement to capitalism. Then in the next phase, Marx is very critical of the capitalist industrialism and capitalism in general. If we look back at this document and just kind of look at some of the interesting language that stands out, or at least stood out to me, when he's thinking about describing this relationship, the Americans are in a position no better than that of serfs, right? Even though slavery exists in the Americas, he's equating even the landowners. He's a member of the Creole class, but he's saying that they are no better than serfs because they're at the whim of this Spanish government, right? The idea of royal monopolies. Anytime you see something about that, royal monopolies, British East India Company, right? Those are things that we associate with mercantilism, exclusive trading privileges. And so here he's also describing that barrier to trade, that barrier to have liberty, freedom of trade, barrier to gain wealth or property. So embedded in this document are those same ideas of Locke, Rousseau, and of the other Enlightenment thinkers that we have been talking about. So that's thinking about revolution, political revolution, enlightenment. I want to shift now to think a little bit more about documents of the Industrial Revolution that you might see in this AP exam. And one of them we were just hinting at. So you're typically going to see on AP exam questions, short answers, DBQs, documents about the industrial era, a lot of writings about the effects of industrialization, whether it's from Britain, continental Europe, writings in the Americas. Also, though, the effects of industrialization around the world, in Japan and China, who have very different experiences with industrialization. Places that kind of get passed up by Europe in this age of industrialization had to play catch up. The Ottoman Empire being a good example. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations often comes up. The writings of Karl Marx and his criticisms of industrialization come up. And then you'll definitely see, this is the era we're getting into the in 1800s, especially the Second Industrial Revolution in the second half of the 1800s, 1850, 1870, 1900, where photography comes about. So you might see images, woodcuts, things like that, but also photographs of industrial working classes, crowded cities, factories, images of immigration. Also, you might get images that are industrial artifacts, maybe showing significant inventions, steam engine, trains, or things that result from them, maps of like the one you see here, or maps of where railroads are being built. So lots of stuff can come from this. It's really hard, I think. I've never really been good at pinning down exactly what type of documents you might get from the Industrial Revolution. Marx, Adam Smith, those are pretty safe bets from this era. But beyond that, really broad spectrum, just because industrialization covers so much. So let's just look at a couple examples here. Let's start with this map, which we've already seen. We have a map here of Europe, its principal industrial regions and directions of spread. The developments depicted in this map were caused by all of the following except. All right, so what we have to think about when we come to this question is, all right, what are the developments being shown here? And then what caused it? So we have principal industrial regions, we have industrialism spreading, and we have these lines that are dated, which give reference to where that industrialism spread and by what year, right? So before 1850, industrialism within the British Isles. By 1870, that spread to northern France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany. By 1914, important date for World War I, we see industrialism spreading throughout most of Europe, although as we get into Eastern Europe and Russia, it's not quite as heavy. So what is it that caused this industrialization and the spread? Go ahead and put it in the chat if you'd like. Was it growing urban populations, provided an available workforce in emergency factories? All the following except, by the way, I forgot to really emphasize that, caused by all the following except. So 3 of these are causes, 1 is not. The availability of vast amounts of farmland in Europe allowed for the expansion of cash crop agriculture, which fed industrialization. C, accumulated capital provided the wealth to fund industrial production. Or D, favorable geographic location of coal, iron, and timber provided the ingredients for industrialization. Sunny has jumped in by answering B. And for sake of time, we're going to speed up. If you're rewatching this later, you can pause it. B is the correct answer. So really great job. One thing that we see in Europe is there's not vast amounts of farmland available. We see actually precursors to the Industrial Revolution. We see great changes in farmland. Less land become available as it's gobbled up by larger landowners. We see the enclosure movement happening. We also have new inventions that produce more food on less land. But ultimately, a lot of the resources come from outside of Europe back in, other than the kind of fuel for industrialization, coal, iron, and timber. So there's a lot of different causes of industrialization listed in the key concepts. There's something that your teacher probably has gone over. I'll run through them real quick. Proximity to waterways, access to rivers and canals, as well as location on the Atlantic Ocean. That geographic distribution of coal, iron, and timber, which provide the metal and the wood to build these machines and the fuel and coal to power them through steam. Urbanization, the growth of cities to provide that workforce. Improved agricultural productivity, which doesn't necessarily come from just vast amounts of land being available. Britain has very limited amounts of land, but the better production on land that is already there, and the consolidation of land. Legal protection of private property, not brought up in this, but that protection of private property, especially in Britain, really helps spur it on as people are willing to invest. Access to foreign resources and the accumulation of capital or wealth, which allows that funding for it. And the question here is, or the comment here, B is kind of part of that mercantilism, raw materials coming from the colonies, definitely 100%. So yeah, there's a lot of those materials being brought back to Europe from these outside regions, and also these manufactured goods being able to be shipped to those territories. All right, here's another image. One of my absolute, this might be, it's tough to say what my favorite source is in all of AP World History, but man, do I love this. If you have a chance, I'll try to remember to put this in the resources, the link to this website. MIT Visualizing Cultures has this beautiful set of images that are found in that depict industrial Japan. And here in this image, called Famous Places in Tokyo, a picture of the Azuma Bridge and a distant view of a torpedo, which, if you're wondering what this kind of cloud thing is, it's water being exploded as a crowd of people come out to enjoy this bridge, ride their fancy carts, and watch this explosion of a torpedo in the harbor. This is just one of like a dozen amazing images that are found on this website. But I want to dig into this image a little bit more and see what we can see. But let me go ahead and give you the question first. Which of the following most directly led to the scene depicted in the image? A, Japanese expansionist policy in the 19th century. B, the isolation of Japan in the face of westward aggression. C, state-sponsored economic reforms following the opening of trade in Japan. or D, the Opium Wars? Which I find most directly led to the scene you have here. And then maybe we can talk about what's going on. All right, so let's see if this matches up with what you thought. The correct answer here, the answer I'm looking for, is C, state-sponsored economic reforms following the opening of trade in Japan. One thing when we think about industrialization is that it spreads beyond Europe. And one of the places it spreads quite successfully and rather quickly is in Japan in the second half of the 19th century. Now, a lot of things led to the scene depicted here. Commodore Matthew Perry arriving in Japan and demanding that they open themselves up to trade in the rest of the world. Up until that point, Japan had been isolated. But faced with the possibility of aggression from the United States, they choose instead to open their doors with the understanding that they will be taught these industrial measures, leading to what is known as the Meiji Restoration, where the Meiji oligarchs kind of whisk the emperor back into prominence in Japan, and they embark on this program to industrialize Japan very quickly through state sponsorship. And Japan and Russia are two of the areas that industrialized through state-sponsored economic reform. And so that economic reform and that push for industrialization leads to some of the things we have here, like steel bridges, like modern military technology with the torpedo. You can also see here a few other things which I think are really fascinating. If we look closely at the image, you see not just the fruits of industrialization with this bridge and with torpedoes, but you also see the influence of the West in dress, the style of military uniforms, the clothes being worn by onlookers. And that is mixed in with, if you notice here in the bottom left-hand corner, a woman with more traditional Japanese clothing. And an umbrella, walking alongside someone in a Western style dress. The carts, very much Western style, but off in the distance, traditional Japanese architecture and temples in the background. So a really interesting image here showing the changes taking place and that come along with industrialization. Now, that's a little bit beyond what I'm supposed to be covering tonight, to be honest. That's more of the effects of industrialization. But I think it's really important to understand that industrialization doesn't just come about because there are people with money. There are efforts being made on behalf of the state to push this. The Opium Wars is incorrect here because that is dealing mostly with China. We might say that could be an indirect cause of all this. The Opium Wars and the example of what happened in China is one of the reasons why Japan does open up trade when confronted by the United States, not wanting to have the same thing happen to them as happened to China with the British, but not a direct cause here. So just what I think is a really rich image that tells us a lot about the changes that are going to take place in Japan that come along with industrialization. All right, we are running very short on time here. So I have just one more excerpt, and I'm just going to leave you with a SAQ that you can practice and think about. This is an excerpt from a work of fiction, but based on his view of the world during the Industrial Revolution. This is an excerpt from Hard Times by Charles Dickens from 1854. It's something we used to read in my classes when talking about the Industrial Revolution. And I just think it's a really interesting imagery to think about the effects of industrialization. Certainly there are many positive effects. We are still, reaping the benefits of the industrial era now, right? We're still in this third phase of humanity of this industrial era. Most important change since we learned to farm, right? But with it came difficulties, came changes to people's lives and the way people live, changes to cities, and they were not always positive. So let's listen to how Charles Dickens describes this town he calls Coke Town, in reference to coke from coal fuel. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of buildings full of windows where there was rattling and trembling all day long, and where pistons of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down. Now, this reading goes on, and I'll allow you to read it. You can pause it if you're rewatching this and take a look at it. But it goes on to talk a lot about the negative aspects, ill-smelling dyes, how people are just one like another, that they are very monotonous. They go on as the same thing day after day after day. Cities all now look the same. The infirmary might have been the jail. The town hall might have been either, or both, or anything else. And in this depiction of industrial life, Charles Dickens is quite critical. He himself received some criticism for his depiction of it in the book. So what I was thinking is, like, well, how might this relate, this really evocative source, this great imagery, relate to what you might be asked to do, let's say, in a short answer. So you get this reading, you come in, maybe it's paired with another reading, which actually would have made this SAQ a little bit easier to write on my behalf. You have this image, this relatively negative portrayal of industrialization. So you might get something like this. Explain one major effect of industrialization that would support Dickens's position on industrialization, right? So you would bring in your knowledge of the effects of industrialization. What might be one negative effect of industrialization that would support what Charles Dickens is saying here? Perhaps you know a specific historical example of the negative effects of industrialization, of health effects of industrialization, of the poor conditions in factories, or poor conditions of cities, or pollution. Explain another major effect of industrialization that would support Dickens's position. And then part C, if you want to kind of think about this as practice, explain one major effect of industrialization that would challenge his position on it. Here, you would have to kind of pull out of the document his negative views of it. And now we're challenging that. What is one positive outcome of industrialization, right? What could you come up with for this? So that's something just to think about. I definitely had some, wanted to look a little bit at the document a little bit closer, but we are running just over the hour, and I promised myself and my wife I would end it at very close to an hour tonight. So, we're looking at this. How do we know it's a negative image? Brick that would have been red if ashes had allowed it. There's another really interesting thing here that we might relate to the development that would soon come of social Darwinism, thinking of the town being unnaturally red and black, like the painted face of a savage, that idea that other peoples are not civilized like Europeans. So Charles Dickens kind of using that imagery that we would not typically approve of today. But while social Darwinism doesn't really get going until 1870s, 1880s, and this being written in the 1850s, you can still see some of those ideas kind of around here. I had a black canal in it, a river with purple, ill-smelling dyes, right? So here you might use this section and the first brick that would have been red to talk about pollution in cities. Contains several large streets, all very like one another. People do the same work again and again, yesterday and tomorrow. So you could talk about the life in urban areas, perhaps the overcrowding of cities, perhaps the monotony of work. So those are some things to consider. If we think also so much fuel consumed, so much money made, we can think about the positive economic effects that come out of industrialization when we think about challenging his ideas. So these are just a smattering of sources. We've been looking at a whole bunch of them as we go. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but it'll give you an idea of kind of the breadth of what you might see on the AP exam. Hopefully, you were able to put any questions in that you had tonight. And certainly we can stick around to answer some in the chat for a little bit after we end this. So if you have them, come at us, come back next week. Don't forget that we have another presentation coming up next week with Jed on the 23rd, reviewing continuity and change in the industrial age. So a little bit more on industrialism, because I know that kind of we went very quickly through that today. So come with your questions next week, and then we'll get into imperialism, which again, an effect of industrialization, before you get to some multiple choice practice with Eric. Anyways, no questions popping up immediately. Oh, this was a source that I had to cut. Sorry guys, this is well, we won't worry about that. Maybe I'll send that to Eric with a question for the units 5 and 6 coming up in a few weeks. But this has been Analyzing Sources from the Age of Revolutions here on Fiveable with me, your host, Patrick Lassiter. Follow me on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube, all that stuff, and join Fiveable if you haven't already. What are you waiting for? It's a great resource. You'll get access to all of the stuff that we did last semester. Tons of stuff on there, really in-depth looks at all of history up through Unit 5. And by the end of the year, every unit. You have a wonderful evening. We hope you study hard, get some sleep tonight, and we'll see you next week.